Mark Reckless.
I'm grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for St Albans. I think she's set a superb example to the Treasury bench on how to extol this policy, and she had also her Westminster Hall debate, which I think was useful in pressing forward the arguments for this. I do think, notwithstanding the procedural issues today, the Treasury does deserve credit for pushing this forward. I know it's after 4.5 years of this government, but the previous government had 13 years, and to be fair, the government before that also 18 years without pushing this overdue but incredibly important and I think beneficial reform. The Honourable Lady for St Albans has done a lot in pushing this forward, but so have other members of the House, honourable members of the House. I recall having a conversation with the Honourable, or perhaps now Right Honourable Member, and at that stage at least friend of mine for Welwyn Hatfield, and I made the case for him for reforming this tax, and he said very clearly to me that if we were to do this, it would need to be revenue neutral. And I think it's the change from that, where however attractive the reform, the number of losers would have made it, I think, quite difficult to do without the £700–800 million per year the Treasury are putting into it. If that money is to be put in, I think to sort of oil the wheels of a reform which gets rid of such very substantial distortions as we had in the previous tax system is a very good way to use that money, and I believe the Treasury have made the right choice in doing that. Constituents of mine in Rochester and Strood, I think, will benefit from this. We have an awful lot in terms of our housing stock that has been around that £250,000 mark, rather less around the £500,000 mark. But at both those levels, basically that fixed charge of £5,000, as soon as you move past that £250,000 or £500,000 point, has been a very significant problem for the housing market. And not just, as Right Honourable Member for St Albans says, the housing market, but also for a lot of those subsidiary industries that are based around that. And that's never been more the case than with the mortgage market review, but also the general reduction in appetite for some of the riskier lending by banks, which has made it difficult for young people and people moving up the early steps of the housing ladder who are often capital constrained, and having to find that extra part for the stamp duty is almost invariably money that can't be spent on something else, and very often actually leads to those transactions not happening. Where I would criticise not the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is the lack of detail, workings and comprehensiveness in terms of its forecast about the housing market and how that fits into its estimates for what this is going to cost. The numbers it gave is estimate transactions would rise by 1.1% on account of this reform. That number, I'm sure, is much lower than the reality we will see. Similarly, they've made an assumption, perhaps forecast they would say, that 0.2% increase in residential investment relative to GDP, yet then they've assumed that will be offset by reductions elsewhere in the economy, which they fail to particularise or really explain at all. And I'm not impressed in this area, but also in others, with the three-men-and-a-dog approach that I think the OBR have often taken. It's no wonder they can't be expected to take on the opposition spending proposals as well, not least because they just look at parts of the government have put and sort of cast their eye over it, scan it a bit and say, oh, well, that sounds reasonable, and just sort of nod it through. And on the housing side, I just don't think they've anywhere near taken into account the positive impact this is going to have on the economy and freeing up transactions, increasing labour mobility, particularly around those £250,000 and £50,000 pinch points. I think this is going to be very significant. We can see in terms of the cost estimate for this year, I think 365 million against 760 for next year and 840 for the following year. They clearly do have some rise in transactions that leads to the annualised cost sort of falling off once we get into the next fiscal year, because there'll have been time for the lags to go through, and we'll be seeing a rise in transactions on account of this. But my very strong suspicion is that rise in transaction will be quite a lot more than the OBR has said will be the case. And also, as the Honourable Lady for St Albans says, there are going to be very significant add-ons to other industries that depend on the housing market. And I think through getting rid of those very significant distortions we've had, there will be dynamic, positive impacts to the economy that the OBR, and as so often the Treasury, have not taken account of. And that is one thing that has held back good reforms of taxes in these areas. I give way.
And as he so rightly said about labour mobility, people have actually said to me they have been deterred about moving into higher house value areas because they will not only have to take on a higher mortgage, that they'll have to find the tax, which is almost a tax on their ability to find a job by moving to where there are more job opportunities, but higher house values.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and that tax, that requirement, comes when people are most capital constrained, particularly with the current mortgage market. So putting the tax in that way restricts mobility, it restricts spending around moving home, it leads to fewer transactions. And I've had constituents who've moved from St Albans to Rochester and Strood, attracted by our better value sort of housing stock. And the Honourable Member for Broxbourne has made a forecast that my return to this House as the UKIP member for Rochester and Strood would lead to falls in house prices across my constituency. I'm not sure that that will be the case, and in any event, I strongly welcome this real supply-side reform, which personally for my constituents, but also for my party, when the government does the right thing, particularly in a very, very sensible supply-side reform, which should free up the market and lead to significantly greater economic activity around the housing market. This is something I'm very happy to support.